Um, Next speaker is a student from University of Cologne. He also works as a consultant and has been working in New Zealand. He will talk about his research topic called information operations, and we'll hear about that now. Please welcome Mr. Sebastian Schröder.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to talk about information operations today. I will give a sector-oriented analysis of the potential impact and possible countermeasures. I'm not too sure if you all know about information operations, so I'm going to start with a short introduction. Later on I'm going to tell you a little bit about the background, the methodology, about my research results, and finally a conclusion. And as I heard before, I can talk a little bit longer, so we will see. I won't do it too long, but we will see how much questions there will be later on. So first of all, the introduction. Information operations. Information operations involves much more than computers and computer networks. It encompasses information in any form and transmitted over any medium. It covers operations against information content and operations against supporting systems, including hardware, software, and human practices. It describes activities that involve the use of powerful new tools the information age has provided to states, military forces, and even individuals to achieve strategic, operational, or tactical advantages and objectives. It raises a mixture of legal and organizational problems due to the pervasive nature of information and reliance on it, the speed of transmission of information, and the diverse fields. So you can see it's a very broad topic, and if you want to talk about information operations, the best you can do is find some definitions which fit into what you want to talk about. So I'm gonna use definitions from the DoD Dictionary of Military and Associated Terms. So information operations normally is in a military context, so most of the definitions and literature you find is with a military background. But I'm gonna talk about this from a research perspective, academic perspective, but you always have to refer on military literature. So you can see in the bottom of each slide there are some references. So if there are specific topics you are interested in more detail, please follow the references, because I can't really go too much in detail. So definitions. Information operations. Information operations are actions taken to affect adversary information and information systems while defending one's own information and information systems. Information warfare, which probably most of you heard already about, probably more than information operations, are information operations conducted during time of crisis or conflict to achieve or promote specific objectives over a specific adversary or adversaries. You can also define defensive and offensive information operations. Defensive information operations aim on protecting and defending information and information systems, and offensive, as the name says, aims on affecting adversary decision makers to achieve or promote specific objectives. So there are a lot of weapons you can use in information operations. Most of them are somehow related to hacking, but there are other methods. For example, in a very extreme way, energy weapons, directed energy weapons, electromagnetic pulse weapons, or destructive microbes. But honestly, this sounds a little bit like science fiction, and even though they might be available, I can't talk about those weapons. But the ones you probably all heard about already, most of you probably very much in detail, are exploitation, back-end trapdoors, social engineering, flood attacks, eavesdropping, spoofing, unauthorized access, malicious software, and indirect vulnerabilities. So information operations has some advantages over physical methods because attacks can be conducted remotely, anonymously, and without large budgets. So let's see some more definitions. We can differ class 1, personal information warfare, class 2, corporate information warfare, class 3, global information warfare. So personal information warfare are attacks against individuals' electronic privacy, including the exposure of digital records and database entries in every place information is stored. So in the majority of the cases, the victims do not know that about this kind of intrusion into their privacy. But I'm going to talk about class 2 and class 3, which is corporate information warfare, warfare between corporations around the world, including disinformation, theft of data, espionage, and data destruction, and global information warfare, which is war against industry, global economical force, or entire countries or states, including sneaking in research data of competitors, theft of secrets, and turning information against its owners. Okay, we are almost through the definitions. You can define 7 forms, which is command and control warfare, intelligence-based warfare, electronic warfare, psychological warfare, hacker warfare, economic information warfare, and cyber warfare. I'm going to focus on hacker warfare and economic information warfare. But the other ones are, mostly with bigger budgets than the other ones. So like intelligence-based warfare or command and control warfare. But let's talk about hacker warfare and economic information warfare. So what is this all about? So this was a research project, InfoSec research project, which lasted 1 year. My main research questions were, what potential risks does I/O pose? What kind of I/O are the most likely ones? What measures are adequate to counter I/O threats? And finally, where are weaknesses that require improvements? So this was the introduction. And now I'm going to talk a little bit about the background. So I don't have that much time to cover the background section in too much detail. So please see the paper and the full version of the slides, which you can download from the conference systems for a full explanation. And you can also follow the references, as I mentioned before, at the bottom of each slide for more details. So, critical infrastructures. Critical infrastructures are those facilities, services, and information systems which are so essential that their incapacity or destruction would have a devastating impact on national security, national economy, public health and safety, and/or the effective functioning of the government. The United States commenced action on an I/O defensive posture by means of 1996 President's Commission on Critical Infrastructure Protection, where 6 at-risk sectors were identified: the defense and government, the information and communication sector, banking and finance, energy, physical distribution, and vital human services. Those sectors, every country will define different sectors which are critical to them. So here's an example of a country with 8 interconnected critical infrastructures. And you can see we have the finance and insurance sector in the middle, and a lot of interconnections to other sectors, including IT and telecommunications, services, energy, public administration, not transportation, but okay. So that's why I'm going to focus on the finance and insurance sector, because there are a lot of potential targets in the financial services sector, including payment system, investment mechanisms, and banking facilities. And just an example of the scope of banking operations, FedWire, which is operated by the US Federal Bureau Reserve Board, processed 108 million transactions in the year 2000, with a total value excess of $379 trillion. So you can imagine if such a system was to be attacked successfully, the consequences for the financial health of several nations would be devastating.
Regarding the reference to the German BSI, is this institution also into this information operations topic? I didn't hear that. To me, this sounds more like a North American approach.
In sense of protecting against it, yes.
So they also
Sorry, okay, I should, okay, the question was if this graphic is from the Federal Office of Information Security, and the question was if they are involved into information operations. So the BSI is just protecting against those things. I will talk about this a little bit later. It's about critical infrastructure protection. So you can see defensive and offensive ways, and they handle this topic from the defensive perspective. But yeah, of course, you have to know about offensive things to protect to protect your own information systems. But yes, all right. Thanks. Okay, so critical infrastructures. So if you talk about information operations, you always talk about critical infrastructures. And as I said before, I'm going to focus on the financial services sector. And there are several trends in the financial services sector, which I will cover very briefly, because there's no secret with this. Everybody knows about them. But there are some aspects which are pretty important to know. So distributed and mobile computing, there's an increasing number of remote access ports on corporate networks. And mobile devices are generally vulnerable to loss and theft. So if you have mobile devices connected via remote access ports and those devices get stolen or something, you normally have an unauthorized access problem. And there's also an increasing amount of sensitive and private data on mobile devices. So this trend is pretty dangerous, even though it has a lot of advantages for cost savings and the like. Outsourcing. So organizations need to protect their information when they outsource. Therefore, the outsourcing contract is one of the key aspects and must be drafted and analyzed by specialists. So I don't want to say that outsourcing is bad, but there are some aspects you have to think about. And I'm going to talk about this a little bit later in a little bit more detail, but just that you heard about it already. So use of the internet. We all know that there's no built-in security and no built-in protection in the internet. And this is pretty bad for confidential and private information. And a reasonable approach would be simply not to connect or strongly quarantine exposure. But unfortunately, commercial and technical pressure are driving most organizations, also in the financial services sector, in the opposite direction. And voice over IP is the same. The same is true for voice over IP, because you have a lot of potential for cost savings and complexity reduction, but threats like call tracking and eavesdropping are pretty hard to counter. Last but not least, open source. Of course, the strongest argument is that if everybody can study the source code and experiment with the software, then bugs are likely to be found and fixed. That's a theory. But once software becomes large and complex, there may be only a few or no capable motivated people inspecting it. On the other hand, there might be attackers who are motivated to spend more time finding bugs or exploitable features than the community of reviewers is. So consequently, the important questions of open source is how much effort was spent by capable people in checking and testing the code, and whether they tell you everything. So, threats.
I think you should put close source on the list as well. Can you please speak? Yeah, okay. Well.
Yeah, I think you should put the term closed source on this issue list as well, because this is also a trend. There are more and more closed source applications and operating systems develop, and this is a security issue too.
Yeah, that's right. I could put a lot of more stuff on this slide, actually, and closed source, of course. But if I talk about open source, the opposite is always closed source. So there's nothing in between. So if I say this is good in open source, the advantages of open source are mostly the disadvantages of closed source, and the other way around. So, but thanks, yeah. Threats. One major difficulty that distinguishes cyber threats from physical threats is determining who is attacking the system, why, how, and from where. This difficulty stems from the ease with which individuals can hide or disguise their tracks by manipulating logs and directing their attacks through networks in many countries before hitting their final target. So many attacks go undetected and unreported. Vulnerabilities in themselves and the existence of methodologies to exploit those vulnerabilities do not constitute a threat to information resources. So a threat arises only when there's a threat source with the intent, capability, and opportunity to carry out an attack. So again, this list could be much longer, but I'm gonna focus on 5 threat sources, namely criminal groups, who attack information systems for purpose of monetary gain, insiders, mercenaries, who mostly work for payment by gaining commercial advantages for their paymasters by means of internal or external espionage, governments and organizations, as well as terrorists. So, if you want to figure out which threats and which threat sources are the most dangerous ones, you could use statistics. But unfortunately, most organizations do not yet know that their defenses have already been breached. Therefore, statistics are only the tip of the iceberg. As you can see, they say viruses have the biggest amount of losses. And on place 6, you can see unauthorized access, which makes less than 1/10 of the loss of viruses. But unauthorized access is actually the most dangerous threat source, the most dangerous threat, and statistics just don't tell anything about this. So, yeah. I don't really think statistics are a good measure or a good method to handle this topic. Okay, background. Now we talk about countermeasures, so how to protect against those threats. And again, more briefly. So countermeasures. Organizations that are unable to counter threats to their information assets will find their corporate credibility, business relationships, and expensively developed brand and brand image damaged. So security is not a product, it's a process. So you need processes, preventive technologies, detecting and reaction capabilities, an entire forensic system to hunt down and prosecute the guilty, but also things people know, relationships between people, how people relate to machines as well as computers, which are complex, unstable, and prone to errors. So especially if you want to counter insider threats, you have to know a lot about the people within your organization. So this is mostly an aspect which is not handled in too much detail. And we will see later on what the consequences are. Another thing is, only if you know your risks, you can protect against them. Therefore, you need to do risk assessment. Risk assessment is a general risk assessment is a part of harm minimization that investigates what you are protecting against, and how much the protection is worth to you. The goal is to provide some assurance that the cost of countermeasures is commensurate with the risks. Without risk assessment, organizations could spend too little or too much. So several methods for analyzing and managing risks exist. I'm going to talk about two. The first one is enterprise risk management. You can see risk assessment is one part of enterprise risk management, namely identify risk, analyze risk, and evaluate risks. And you have to establish a context, and you have to treat the risks, and you have to do monitoring and review, as well as communication and consulting. So risk assessment can be seen as part of enterprise risk management, and this is defined in the standard AS/NZS 4360. And this standard extends the traditional risk management by establishing the context and communicating and consult. Another method is CRUM, which is a trade-off between the impact of the risk and the cost of countermeasures. The method is a staged and disciplined approach embracing technical and non-technical aspects of security and should be used during the system development process, throughout the operational life cycle of the system, and whenever any alteration, including enhancement, is made. So how does this work? You have analysis and you have management. In the analysis part, you have to identify and value your assets that make up the information systems. Then you have to identify the possibility of the problem occurrence and calculate the risk level. And then in the management steps, you have to use countermeasures and compare them against the security level. So this sounds very good, I guess, but as you can see, there will be always some vulnerabilities remaining, because often the countermeasures are too expensive to justify an implementation. So even if you know your risks, you sometimes just don't do anything against it, because it's just too expensive. And especially in big organizations, you always have some vulnerabilities left, which is kind of the basis of information operations, because if you know about those vulnerabilities, maybe through insiders or something, you can attack this organization, and this can be kind of devastating. So another thing is, and I guess not many people heard about this before, cyber risk insurance. So technical countermeasures cannot completely reduce an organization's risk to security breaches. Therefore, more and more organizations turn to insurance to deal with the risk of substantial financial losses that remains after technical countermeasures have been implemented. So there are some companies which offer those policies, but as important as finding the right product is finding the right insurer. Key criteria are financial strength, experience, and claims philosophy. And to illustrate this a little bit, you do your risk assessment, as I explained before, then you reduce the risk of security breaches, then the vulnerabilities which you know about and which are still there are reduced by insurance, so that you don't have too big financial risks. And only then you maintain your risk at an acceptable level. And you always have, this is an ongoing process which you have to do on a regular basis. And this means there's a trade-off between the amount that should be spent on countermeasures and the amount that should be spent on insurance. So, security policy. An information security policy describes the philosophy by which security is managed. The spine of a good security policy is risk assessment. It specifies who should be allowed access, to what resources, and how this access is regulated. So most organizations have their security policies, but in the majority of cases, they are not really enforced. So generally, in the end, it comes down to a matter of trust. Who do we trust enough to allow which type of access to what resources? It is important that security policies are realistic and that they address the needs using terms and definitions relevant to the organizations, because otherwise people simply work around them to the detriment of security. Okay, again a list which could be much longer. Again, I guess everybody of you knows about those security measures, so I don't have to talk about this in detail. Just to name some: secure the physical environment. Then you have to use firewalls as a perimeter defense. You have to implement intrusion detection and prevention capabilities. You have to audit to monitor authorized and unauthorized access. You have to encrypt information on its way through the networks and when it is stored on clients and servers. You should automate security as fast as possible and create a computer secure defense plan. We will analyze all those measures later on. I just have to explain it a little bit. I had to do this explanation so that you can follow me later on. So sorry if it's a little bit boring right now. So network security. I just talked about intrusion detection and prevention a little briefly. Today, the use of tunneling and encryption means to put more content out of the reach of perimeter control. But unfortunately, when network traffic increases, intrusion detection systems are extremely challenging to understand and manage due to an increasing number of generated alerts. Intrusion prevention systems are either network-based or host-based, active inline devices that can detect anomalies in the regular routine of network traffic and then stop the possibly malicious activity. But even though intrusion prevention systems will prevent attacks, some might slip through. Then, deceptive tactics could provide another line of defense. Honeypots and honeynets are simply decoy deception technique that is increasingly popular. But unfortunately, honeypots are relatively passive deception that is easy to recognize by packet sniffers or system inspection. A real computer system that serves real needs is more likely to fool an attacker. And such a system could be part of active network defense. Okay, information assurance. Just a question, who of you heard about defense in depth already? Okay, some, that's good. So, information assurance stands for information operations that protect and defend information and information systems. A practical strategy for achieving information assurance is called defense in depth. Its aim is to establish protection across multiple layers and dimensions that will cause an adversary who penetrates or breaks down one barrier to promptly encounter another barrier and then another until the attack ends. So, as deeper your critical systems are in your information system network, for example, the harder it gets for an attacker to find the information he's interested in. So, organizations need to expect attacks and include attack detection tools and procedures that allow them to react to and recover from these attacks. And defense in depth integrates the three primary elements: people, operations, and technology. And for further information, I can recommend the paper which is which you can see in the references from the NSA, which yeah, talks about this topic very good. So I think it would last too long to talk about this in more detail now. Okay, and finally, infrastructure protection. So we were talking about infrastructures before, and you asked me about the BSI, what they are doing there in this context. So there are some instances in every state which do critical infrastructure protection. So nearly all industrialized countries have set up or setting up centers for critical infrastructure protections that keep relationships between each other, as well as with law enforcement, intelligence, infrastructure owners and operators, and other diverse instances. The aim is to provide timely and relevant information about rising threats and general IT security issues. And just as an example, New Zealand's critical infrastructure protection centers functions are divided into 3 main groups, which are a 24/7 watch and warn function, investigation and analysis function, and an outreach and training broking function. Okay, so taking this into account, we know the background. So let's see what this all about. It's pretty hard to find information about information operations, unclassified information. So what I had to do is I asked experts and from different organizations and for their opinion about main threat sources, actual trends, IO weapons, and the countermeasures. And during the project, other people with diverse occupation and backgrounds were asked about particular aspects to adjust at extensive findings. And then, to see how it works in the, out there, I used a case study to gather practical insights. But as you can imagine, it's pretty hard to find companies who say, okay, no problem, come to us and try what you can find out. So, and also most people in high positions do not want to talk about the weaknesses within their organization. But fortunately, one CIO in a small financial services organization participated. And I wanted to do some field experiments, which goes a little bit further than case studies, but this approach was likely to raise ethical and legal issues, so this was not possible. So, yep.
What would be a potential experiment scenario for you? So what do we have to imagine if you say you want to start an experiment in this field? Establish a threat and just let it loose on an organization, looks what it does with it?
You could do, for example, penetration tests on a sector-wide basis, so not within an organization or even within an organization, but more likely inter-organizational penetration testing. So also between different sectors. So, for example, what happens if the telecommunication sector is attacked? Which financial institutions have problems by this? And yeah, so you actually would start offensive information operations and see what happens. But yeah, you can imagine that this would raise ethical and legal issues. So, and if you go to a company and say, okay, I just want to start an experiment, they either say no or they say yes, and then it's pretty likely that you don't have the original circumstances if they agree. So this is pretty hard, and from a research perspective, yeah, not really possible. So, in order to ensure confidentiality, the names of the interviewees and the organizations are not included in the presentation. So, let's come to the research results. So, when I went through the presentation before, I went through the background section a little bit quicker, but they told me that I can talk a little bit longer, so thanks. So, the results of my research. First, I talked about the threat sources. And foreign organizations and governments, including the intelligence community, are already equipped with or actually establishing industrial or economic espionage capabilities. Even though attacks from those sources typically aim on the targets, on other targets, it is obvious that the FSS, financial services sector, handles sensitive information, especially from a privacy perspective. So threats arising from those sources are currently not usually considered, even though the impact, especially on confidentiality and availability, can be immense in time of crisis. So just imagine there's a war and you want to attack a country. You normally can start I/O and you don't have to do any physical destruction. I mean, this is critical from some perspectives. So, firstly, you can save lives, of course, but the impact on the health of the country can be pretty bad. So, this is pretty controversial. But I don't want to talk too much about ethical issues. So we have also attacks from terrorists, and business continuity can generally be guaranteed in the event of such an attack. But when an attack is successfully accomplished, it might result in public attention, leading to fear within the population, indirect consideration of terrorist political, ideological, or social intentions, and or negative repudiation for financial services organizations. Then we have criminal groups. They generally attack the weakest link, the customer, for purpose of monetary gain. They are dangerous in sense of indirect vulnerabilities, especially through phishing and malicious software. So those methods normally aim on authentication information, yeah, those indirect vulnerabilities are not directly I/O related, so I won't discuss this exhaustively. But kind of interesting is that the methods of those criminal groups are getting better and better. So just an example, phishing emails are not simple broadcasts anymore. They are normally well targeted by compromised private data, and as I said, it's not really I/O related. So more interesting are mercenaries and insiders. So I/O attacks performed by insiders can generally be seen as very dangerous. And mercenaries can act remotely or masquerade as insiders, utilizing compromised employee or administration accounts. And the risk of insider attacks worsens when mercenaries are employed by an organization in the FSS so that they can act as legitimized insiders. You can imagine if mercenaries are well prepared and have the right knowledge, they can cause a lot of harm in the role of an insider. Therefore, mercenaries can be declared as the most dangerous threat source. And as I mentioned before, mercenaries in the role of an insider are the most dangerous threat source. And yeah, also criminal groups, foreign organizations, governments, and terrorists are likely to hire mercenaries or to develop professional in-house capabilities. Current trends. Let's talk about the trends. Outsourcing is a very controversial trend. As I mentioned before, you have to think about the contract, the outsourcing contract. So normally it might enhance the general security of an organization due to better transparency in terms of cost and security aims. And security policy becomes an integral part of the contract. But on the other hand, there may be implementation and technology failure risks, or you have a more complex business continuity planning. And from a concentration perspective, you have a lack of control and a systematic risk to the industry as a whole. So, open source software was mostly seen as a positive influence on security. And open source products are seen to be more secure than closed source software, not only because of the possibility to verify the source code of applications and OS features on critical systems, but also because of the possibility to enhance open source products by further development. So one interviewee mentioned that in some cases, the basic authentication module was enhanced by including smart card capabilities on top of the basic password authentication. The same possibility exists for biometric authentication mechanisms. The use of the internet is essential to provide customer services as well as to perform transaction and collaboration. But unfortunately, most of the attacks come from the internet, and this makes it necessary to have sufficient countermeasures in place. And the increasing adoption of remote connections can be dangerous, especially, and this happens in a lot of cases, if devices are compromised or connected to the internet and the corporate network at the same time. So in this constellation, there's a substantial risk that malicious software can spread, especially if no network security measures are in place. And one interviewee mentioned that a large FSS organization directly connects its remote workplaces per dial-up to the corporate network without any other countermeasures in place. So this is kind of dangerous. And you also have implementation flaws in short-range links, such as Bluetooth, which can result in large quantities of confidential data loss. And just imagine that there's a big building with a lot of mobile devices which communicate via Bluetooth, and an attacker is about 2 kilometers with the right equipment further and collects all those information from the mobile devices. I mean, yeah, I don't want to have, I wouldn't like to have all my mobile contacts or something in the hands of attackers. So also you have M-payment mechanisms which are still not secure enough to face the trust issue of customers. And most e-commerce payment methods are not cannot be adapted to M-payment. So, and on the other, and also location-based services raise further concerns, especially from a privacy perspective. So, if we see the trends, we can say mobile computing is a very important trend, but unfortunately the trend with the most security issues. And just to name some concerns, user identification, secure storage, secure data communication, tamper-resistant implementations, secure software execution, secure network access, and secure content. And this affects device security, network and session security, and application and payment security. We have a lot of concerns and a lot of attack points in mobile computing. And it also has an influence on several other trends, So mobile computing is a hype, but pretty dangerous. So the weaponry. The interviewee said that espionage capabilities generally enable foreign organizations, governments all over the world to eavesdrop communication links, mainly wide area networks. So this is especially dangerous because of the poor threat awareness. So not many people think about emails they send through the internet, if they are encrypted or not. And this is okay on a private sector maybe, but not in the financial services sector or the like. And also flood attacks. You don't really have to be afraid of flood attacks if you have high-speed redundant connectivity, but in a small and medium-sized business, you are normally aware of this. But even for large FSS organizations, flood attacks can be pretty dangerous if they are targeted against back-end systems by small front-end requests, which trigger complex back-end requests. So eavesdropping. The vulnerability level of eavesdropping depends very much on the size of the organization. And in many organizations, it is likely that some of the network traffic remains unencrypted. So budget constraints lead to an unsatisfactory secure physical environment, weak critical network zone encapsulation, and deficient audit and incident response capabilities. And access points placed by malicious insiders within a corporate network could remain undetected, at least in small or medium-sized institutions. One interviewee said that there's a wireless LAN police in their organization which run around with detection tools, but I guess in medium-sized organizations you don't have this. And it's getting even worse if you start a well-targeted eavesdropping attack by, for example, placing a mobile computing device with eavesdropping capabilities inside the network or between the network and a specific host. And while communicating per UMTS with a managing instance, such an attack might remain undetected in large corporations as well. And in addition, some cryptographic mechanisms are often insecurely implemented, enabling an attacker to break end-to-end encryption. So as soon as you're inside an organization, the eavesdropping is a pretty dangerous weapon. Backdoors. The main focus lies on backdoors and software, but you have, of course, a possibility to have backdoors in hardware, which is known as chipping, and it is often not really recognized, especially in network or security-related hardware. So, as an example, network printers can be easily manipulated and are not likely to be checked on a regular basis. So statistics confirm that malicious software can be identified as one of the most dangerous weapons. The main question is how fast systems are patched so that exploitable components are not vulnerable anymore. Successful malicious software attacks, individually or generally targeted, can have an enormous impact, especially on availability and confidentiality. They could also result in indirect vulnerabilities like compromised customer authentication data through phishing or Trojan horses, as well as negative repudiation in the event of successful attack. Unauthorized access. So password authentication is not appropriate, especially on critical systems. But even passwords are still handled inappropriately or given away to colleagues. Single sign-on solutions based on passwords have weaknesses as well. So an extension with smart card capabilities, as often practice, increases security, but this enhancement is obviously useless when, for example, employees leave their smart cards in the card reader during their lunch break. So biometric mechanisms are still not highly developed enough to solve those problems. And Starbuck will talk about this issue later tonight. And in addition, costs for major authentication mechanisms are often seen as too high by FSS management, particularly in small and medium-sized organizations. So even if there are the best measures available on the market, they are normally not implemented due to too high costs. Okay. Mobile attacks. So mobile computing comes along with an important issue from an attacker perspective. So users of wireless devices can go online and offline easily. And that makes it difficult to trace back attackers to a fixed geographic point. And therefore, attacks over mobile communication systems might become a preferred method in the future. And social engineering is seen as one of the most effective methods to gather authentication information or sensitive information about internal structures through, for example, aggregation of publicly available data or insider deception. One interview mentioned the possibility to trick security agents when, for example, external specialists, contractors are known by security agents. In this event, they might still get access to an organization, even though they are not involved into projects anymore. Awareness seminars address social engineering amongst other issues, but circumstantial audit is not possible in most cases due to staff association objections and legal issues. So, the essence: unauthorized access and malicious software were identified as the most dangerous IO weapons. And as you can see, when you are aware of those two weapons separately, you decrease the vulnerability level of other weapons as well. So unauthorized access and malicious software have to get special attention to decrease the likelihood of successful conducted IO attack.
Thank you for your presentation, but I think we cover more or less only computer infrastructure protection from operation, and the weaponry you present were more or less a tool to support information, because information operation is based asymmetric warfare also, and the way the conflict are today. So information operation is the way US are using information in Iraq. Like a classical way to use information operation is to drop leaflet in certain way, or in modern way to create a new TV channel, or to create new newspaper like Iraq Today, which spread for more than 1 year over there. To just respond to the questions before, depending the country is different way to have information operation. In Switzerland, oui?
Can I just reply on your first question or on your first statement?
Yeah.
So, that's why I said I focus on hacker and economic warfare. What you said is psychological warfare and
information operation today. If you take into account the conceptuality of information dominant from the US, is combined between diplomatic and military and politic. You know, it's difficult sometimes to dissociate information operation under that aspect. We can consider the decision to send troops in Iraq was information operation aspect also. We can consider the draw of Mohammed was kind of information operation also, and touch the economy side. Is a perception management aspect of information operation. And this was more on critical infrastructure protection, in my opinion.
Yeah, that's very good point, and thank you. But that's why I said that it's a very broad topic, and if you do a research on it, you have to focus on some aspects. And it's true. I read a book about peace operations in Iraq from operation, and this is a war. This is not a espionage or something. I mean, of course, on a top country, if you want to take gun, you have to do psychic warfare. But I mean, it's an IT conference, and that's why I focus on security aspects. But very interesting. If you want, can play on about those aspects. Thank you. So, yeah, the weapons, as I mentioned, are unauthorized access and malicious software, and require special attention. The most important weapons. Okay, so next I talked about the countermeasures with the experts, and they say many countermeasures are currently available. In large FSS institutions, a lot of money is allocated to countermeasures, but in small and medium-sized organizations, the trade-off between potential risk and monetary resources available is very high. So, during the interviews, it transpired that most technical countermeasures are already somehow implemented or at least discussed in large FSS organizations. But non-technical countermeasures, such as cyber risk insurance, seem to be not that much recognized in the FSS, probably because they still remove only a small number of risks. Network security. Firewall rules need to be updated and evaluated on a regular basis to ensure that no vulnerabilities exist through outdated permissions. While network-based intrusion detection system capabilities are normally already in place, there seems to be a backlog demand in intrusion prevention and behavior monitoring capabilities. All interviewees agreed that simple access logs are not enough. But unfortunately, intrusion prevention systems and behavior monitoring require enormous setup and administration time and effort. So, allowed or forbidden behaviors are in the majority of cases hard to define because workflows vary in terms of behavior. And even though intrusion prevention systems and behavior monitoring mechanisms are not practical for every workstation, they have potential to be good mechanisms to identify malicious activities performed by insiders, which were the most important or most dangerous threat. So, in this context, one interviewee mentioned that the patching level of network hardware is in many cases up to date, but in some cases outdated. So, as I said, network printers are pretty dangerous, and you heard about Cisco hardware probably, where a lot of vulnerabilities exist. If you don't update those, an attacker who's inside the organization has a lot of potential to gain critical information. So, critical systems without sufficient network security measures in place are generally more vulnerable to misuse and confidential data ship-off. And some very large financial services organizations experiment with honeypots as an instrument for identifying compromised hosts within the corporate network. So, one interviewee mentioned that those honeypots might rather be part of honeynets, which are already installed in diverse organizations across different industries for the general purpose of learning and analyzing attackers' activities. Another interviewee said, which is very interesting, that there are too many other problems which have to be solved before it makes sense to implement such measures. So, but however, honeypots obtain little attention, even though they could be a good extension to intrusion prevention systems and a good mechanisms to disguise the real network topology, which goes along with defense and depth as well. Risk management and personal security. Risk assessment is seen as the initial step for security. There's a general trend to institutionalization, formalization, and standardization of risk management methods. So security policies need to be developed based on the risks identified and enforced utilizing compliance management mechanisms. And to counter threats arising from insiders, personal security is very important. One interviewee told me that in some organizations there are some methods next to technical measures like employee screening, including criminal records and reference checking, awareness seminars, and methods to improve employee satisfaction. This is necessary, but mostly not enough. So in very sensitive areas, people often have to perform a vetting or even lie detector tests. And moreover, the need-to-know principle is applied in sensitive areas. Okay, we're talking about very big institutions. You can imagine that this is not true for medium-sized or even small-sized institutions. Okay. And operating system and application security. Antivirus as well as OS hardening and patching are essential countermeasures, especially in terms of mobile computing. And vulnerability scans need to be performed regularly. Patching mechanisms for software and hardware have significant optimization potential. And systems often remain unpatched for hours or accidentally even days. And in addition, patching often has side effects on diverse applications. So if you have a complex application landscape in your organization, you normally don't say, okay, there's a new patch, let's install, and everything is fine. Normally you have to do copious tests before finally implementing patches on productive systems, which makes the time for patching a system very long. And sometimes those days even get months or weeks or months. So, and another difference is, or a big difference is that the application landscape in banks seems to be generally more standardized than in insurance companies. So therefore, it can be assumed that malicious software has a higher vulnerability probability in insurance companies than in banks. Okay, the question was why the probability is higher in insurance companies. And this can be assumed because if the software is more standardized and if more companies use it and if more people work on security measures for those software landscapes, you normally have a higher degree in security than in homebrew applications, which you sometimes find in insurance companies. Do you have any evidence for that? Yeah, I saw it by myself already, but yeah, we can talk about this later on. Okay, so as I said before, the confidentiality, I'm not. Can't name any companies or something, but yeah, it's definitely the case that insurance companies have.
Hi Reggie, if you can hear me, please come to the front office. Hi Reggie, please come to the front office.
Okay. Yeah, but that's a good point as well. Thanks. It's just the case you have complex applications in insurance companies. And those complex applications are sometimes well understood in the first time, but they are in use for about 20 or 30 years. The people who develop those software components are not in the company anymore. It's like a black box which just stands there and it just works. You put something in there to get an output and that's it. So this normally doesn't happen that much in banks, but it's often the case in insurance companies. Without naming any. The experts confirmed this. So they said just banks are, normally banks have standardized products in place. So, yeah. Is this, okay. Okay. Cryptography and authentication. So there are still unencrypted protocols in place. And one expert said that they use Telnet for their system administration within the corporate network. So, yeah. And also, in some cases, cryptographic measures are incorrectly used or implemented. And this makes it potentially vulnerable to, for example, man-in-the-middle attacks. In terms of mobile computing, there's a backlog demand and encryption mechanisms of data stored in mobile devices and additional mediums. Moreover, computational constraints of mobile devices often force manufacturers to the implementation of insufficiently cryptographic measures. Authentication mechanisms are one of the main measures to counter unauthorized access and need to be addressed from several perspectives, including particular physical environments, critical systems, particular remote services, and mobile devices. A backlog demand of secure and resource-friendly authentication mechanisms, especially in mobile computing, exists. So, 2 more slides for countermeasures. And physical security is mostly well understood and relatively easy to implement. But unfortunately, physical security breaks down when there are non-physical paths by which assets may be attacked. And the internet provides a lot of those paths. At present, physical security plays a big role, especially in mobile computing. In sensitive areas, SALI ports with strong physical security, such as no-loan-go zones, which ensure that one person cannot be in that area unattended, as well as strong authentication mechanisms are in place. But there are still areas remaining which could be protected much better. One interviewee mentioned that FSS structure is likely to be vulnerable to attacks due to weak physical security in some areas. So insiders who know about those less secured areas could give away this knowledge or start targeted attacks. Sufficient backup mechanisms are mostly in place, including redundancy across different locations from an information assurance perspective. And there's a trend to storage area networks, mostly offered by outsourcing providers. Further methods protecting availability of data and resources include business continuity planning and disaster recovery. Those two are also known as incident response management and can be managed as risk assessment or part as such. And critical infrastructure protection can generally be seen as a good measure if sufficient encouragements or resources are provided. This seems to be the case, at least in most large FSS organizations. So, the essence. We can see that risk assessment on the top influences security policy. And security policy influences awareness, compliance, behavior monitoring, access control, and physical security. On the other hand, cryptography influences OS security and network security. So, if you focus on cryptography and risk assessment, you have most of the countermeasures somehow carried out. But you also have to focus on access control, physical security, OS security, and network security. And actually, you have to cover all of those countermeasures somehow. And just to see that risk assessment is one of the most important ones. Cryptography, in terms of eavesdropping, is the other very important one. Okay, so those were the results of the interviews, and I see some people are going to the other presentations. So, case study. Main concerns were that I/O that sensitive data files or figures could be accessed, deleted, or damaged, especially by competitors within the industry. And while it's not directly I/O related, the main issues were privacy aspects. An informal risk analysis has been performed. Main threats related to I/O were identified as lack of user awareness, especially in the following areas: unauthorized access to data and therefore arising privacy matters, security settings, and why they should not be downgraded to a lower level than is necessary for the business to operate, various threats arising from malicious software. So current countermeasures in place are ongoing operating system hardening, regular updates of virus and spyware signatures, host-based intrusion detection systems and behavior monitoring on critical systems, firewalls in terms of network security, basic compliance management mechanisms, and access control based on passwords. So future countermeasures will especially address network security, continuously monitoring of user actions, and simple matters like rotating stuff through specific areas and not having one person doing everything. Regular updates of key programs with service packs, and finally, if utilizing local software, an independent audit has to be commissioned. I/O awareness. Insufficient encouragements or resources were provided from critical infrastructure protection initiatives. In fact, the participant was not aware it existed. So the participant feels that the FSS as a whole is not sufficiently aware of information operation and the threats it poses. Moreover, he believes that the financial services sector is not adequately prepared to withstand a significant I/O attack. Especially at small business levels, management and staff are generally not aware of real threats and how to minimize or prevent the likelihood of their occurrence. In his opinion, the FSS has to be addressed at all levels with at least an overview. Information should be updated on a regular basis. Conclusions. So, main security concerns include social engineering, malicious software, flaws in physical security, poor authentication mechanisms, exploitable vulnerabilities in software and hardware, and insufficient network security. Mobile computing is a similar trend but comes along with several backlog demands. The most dangerous threat source was identified as mercenaries and the role of an insider. Main countermeasures taken by the FSS are risk assessment, security policies, access control, physical security, OS security, basic network security, and cryptography. The implementation depends mostly on the size of the organization and the money available for security measures. Awareness seminars and campaigns need to be conducted internally and externally on a regular basis, and critical infrastructure protection efforts need to be communicated frequently at all FSS levels. And finally, weaknesses. So threats against customer data need to be conducted across the whole FSS in connected service sectors and on the customer side. To counter insider threats, personal security and employee satisfaction must be exercised. Incident management needs to be performed on an FSS-wide basis. Information assurance and security policy compliance management need to be addressed more frequently. Patching mechanisms need to be optimized in many cases. Further backlog demands were identified in intrusion prevention systems and behavior monitoring capabilities. Physical security and access control require improvements. Cryptographic measures must be implemented within the whole FSS. And deceptive tactics and insurance policies should be considered as potentially good countermeasures. Finally, in general, information concerning specific organizational security issues in this area is pretty hard to obtain. However, it is apparent from the above that information operations directed against the financial services sector has the potential to cause significant harm at many levels: individual customer, financial institutions, national or even international. The threats in this area, which are increasing in frequency and sophistication, need to be taken seriously. Formal risk analysis need to be undertaken and appropriate countermeasures implemented. Identified weaknesses need to be addressed at certain levels. Okay, and then I would like to thank my supervisor and I-security lecturer. Without his guidance, this research project would not have materialized. Special thanks go out to the case study participant and the expert interviewees, and also thanks to all other people who supported this research project with helpful suggestions, expertise, or information. Thank you.